The sound came suddenly, faint at first, like a soft whimper carried on the wind. He stopped in his tracks, glancing around. The path was deserted, lined by tall trees and shadows that stretched endlessly into the dark. He waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Shaking his head, he kept walking, telling himself it was just the wind. But a few steps later, there was again, louder this time, an unmistakable sound of pain. He hesitated, heart pounding, and turned toward the trees. Logic told him to keep walking, to mind his own business and leave it alone. But something deeper, something instinctive, pushed him forward. Stepping off the path, he ventured into the shadows, the dim light of the street lamps fading behind him. The sound grew clearer with every step, a soft, labored breathing mixed with a low, almost inaudible groan. As he pushed through a thicket, his foot caught on something, and he nearly stumbled. Looking down, he froze. There, half hidden by fallen leaves and branches, was a figure. At first, he thought it was a person, maybe someone hurt or passed out. But as he knelt closer, his breath caught in his throat. She wasn't human, not entirely, at least. Her skin was an iridescent silver, glinting faintly, even in the faint moonlight. Her hair, or what resembled hair, shimmered like strands of liquid light, and her eyes, closed now, were framed by features that were almost human, yet unmistakably alien. She was injured, that much was clear. A deep gash ran along her side, oozing a thick, dark liquid that didn't look like blood. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle. For a moment, he could only stare, the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing freezing him in place. But then she stirred, a faint sound escaping her lips, a word, or maybe just a plea. Whatever it was, it snapped him out of his daze. Hey, it's okay," he said instinctively, though he wasn't sure if she could understand him. He dropped his backpack and knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly. "You're hurt. I'm going to help, okay?" Again, he wasn't sure if she could hear him, let alone comprehend, but he had to try. She flinched as he touched her arm, her eyes flickering open for the briefest moment. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen, brilliant, glowing, and filled with a mix of pain and fear. But there was something else, too, something that almost looked like relief. She didn't resist as he carefully lifted her, though her body was limp and unnaturally light, as if gravity barely held her. His mind raced as he carried her back toward the dorm. What was he supposed to do? Call someone? The authorities? But the thought made his stomach churn. Whatever or whoever she was, she didn't need to be discovered. She needed help. And for some reason he couldn't explain, he felt responsible. Reaching his room, he pushed the door open with his shoulder, his heart pounding louder than ever. He laid her carefully on his bed, grabbing a towel to press against the wound on her side. Her breathing hitched as he worked, her body trembling faintly. "It's okay," he whispered again, his voice softer now. "You're safe. I promise." The towel soaked through quickly, and he knew he needed more than makeshift first aid. He rummaged through his bag and found a clean shirt, tearing it into strips to use as bandages. He worked quickly, his hands shaking but steady enough to wrap the wound as best as he could. When he was done, he sat back, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. She was still unconscious, but her breathing had evened out, the tension in her body easing slightly. He watched her for a long moment, his mind swirling with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why was she here, injured and alone? He reached for his phone, hesitating with his finger hovering over the screen. He wanted to look something up, to call someone, to do anything that might give him answers. But a voice in the back of his mind stopped him. If he involved anyone else, it might put her in danger. And despite the insanity of the situation, he felt an overwhelming need to protect her. Hours passed, the night dragging on as he kept vigil by her side. He couldn't bring himself to sleep, every sound outside his window setting him on edge. She stirred occasionally, her face twisting in pain or her hand twitching faintly. Each time, he leaned forward, murmuring reassurances, even though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the curtains, she opened her eyes again. This time, they stayed open, focusing on him with an intensity that made him hold his breath. She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injury. He reached out instinctively, his hands hovering just above her shoulders. Don't move too much. You're still hurt." She didn't speak, but her gaze locked onto his, unblinking and searching. For a moment, he wondered if she could understand him, or if she was just trying to make sense of the situation. Then, to his surprise, she nodded, just a small, almost imperceptible movement, but enough to make his heart skip. You understand me?" he asked, hesitantly. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no sound came. Instead, she raised a hand, her fingers trembling as she gestured toward her side. He followed her gaze, his stomach twisting as he saw the makeshift bandages already darkening with her strange blood. "I did the best I could," he said quickly, his words tumbling out. "I'm not a doctor, but I didn't know what else to do." She raised a hand, silencing him without a word. Her expression softened, and she nodded again, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ease some of the tension gripping him. For the first time since finding her, he allowed himself to breathe. He didn't know what was going to happen next, or how he was going to keep her safe. But for now, she was alive, and that was all that mattered. The questions could wait. The fear could wait. For now, he was just grateful he had found her in time. Outside, the campus was waking up, students beginning their day as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But in his small dorm room, everything had changed. The girl alien, otherworldly, and undeniably real, was proof that the universe was far bigger and more mysterious than he could have ever imagined. And though he didn't know it yet, his decision to save her would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. As the early sunlight filtered into the room, the boy sat by the bed, watching over her as if any moment something else might happen. His mind swirled with unanswered questions. Who was she, really? How had she ended up here? And, more urgently, who or what had hurt her? He had spent most of the night resisting the urge to search for answers online, knowing that even a stray question might raise suspicions. If she was being hunted, the last thing he wanted to do was draw attention to her. The girl shifted slightly, her breathing more even now, though her face still bore faint traces of pain. Her hand rested limply on the blanket, its unusual texture glinting faintly in the soft light. He noticed the tiny, intricate lines etched into her skin, almost like circuitry, shimmering with a faint glow. It was mesmerizing, but also unsettling. She was so different, yet something about her vulnerability felt deeply familiar, almost human. He leaned forward, his voice soft and unsure. "You're safe now. I promise. But I don't know how to help you." He wasn't even sure she could understand him, yet something about her earlier nod, her faint attempts to communicate, made him believe that she could. Hours passed, and the campus grew louder outside. Footsteps and laughter echoed in the hallways, as other students went about their day, oblivious to the secret hidden behind his door. He was grateful for the lock, though it wasn't much of a barrier if anyone decided to come in. He'd already silenced his phone, not wanting to deal with friends or questions he couldn't answer. His world had narrowed to this room, to this strange girl who had fallen into his life without warning. By midday, she stirred again, her eyelids fluttering open. This time, her gaze was more focused, sharper. She struggled to sit up, her movements slow and shaky. He quickly moved to her side, his hands hovering as if afraid to touch her without permission. "Easy," he said softly. "You're still hurt." She turned her head toward him, her glowing eyes studying him intently. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with unspoken questions. Then, she surprised him by speaking. Her voice was soft, melodic, and layered with an accent he couldn't place. The words were unfamiliar, alien, but there was a plea in her tone that he understood immediately. She needed help. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "But I want to." Can you try again?" She frowned slightly, as if concentrating, and then spoke again. This time, her words were halting, broken, but unmistakably in his language. "Where am I?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it was enormous. He hesitated, unsure how much to tell her, or even if she could handle the truth. "You're on Earth," he said finally. "In my dorm room. I found you outside, in the woods. You were hurt." Her expression shifted, a mix of confusion and something darker, fear, perhaps, or recognition. She glanced down at her bandaged side, her fingers brushing over the makeshift dressing. "You helped me." "Yeah," he said, nodding. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just leave you there." She looked up at him again, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "Thank you." The words were simple, but the sincerity in her tone made his chest tighten. He nodded, unsure how to respond. "What happened to you?" he asked after a moment. "How did you get here?" Her gaze flickered to the window, as if she were searching for something beyond the glass. "I was running," she said slowly, her words still halting. "Chased. I crashed. Shit gone." He tried to piece together her fragmented explanation, his mind racing. A ship. She had been in some kind of shit, and it was gone. Destroyed, maybe. Or taken? "Who was chasing you?" he asked, his voice low. Her expression darkened, and she shook her head. "Dangerous. They want me." "Why?" he pressed gently. "Why would they hurt you?" She hesitated, her hands clenching the blanket as if struggling to find the right words. "Because I left. I knew too much." His stomach twisted. Whatever she had been involved in, it was clear she was in deep trouble. And now, by helping her, he might be too. He didn't regret his decision, but the weight of it was starting to settle heavily on his shoulders. "Okay," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll figure this out. But you need to rest for now. You're still healing." She nodded slowly, leaning back against the pillows. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her body seemed to sag under its own weight. Yet there was a resilience in her, a determination that shone through even in her weakened state. He didn't know much about her, but he could already tell she was a fighter. Over the next few hours, he did his best to make her comfortable. He brought her water, though she seemed hesitant to drink it at first, examining it as if unsure it was safe. When she finally took a sip, her expression softened, and she nodded in approval. He offered her some food, but she only shook her head, murmuring something about it being different. He made a mental note to ask her what she could eat later, assuming she even needed food the way humans did. As the day turned to evening, The tension in the room began to ease slightly. She was still weak, but she seemed more alert, her gaze sharper as she watched him move around the room. Occasionally, she would ask a question, her voice soft but curious. "What is this place?" she asked once, gesturing vaguely to the walls. "It's my dorm," he explained, "where I live while I'm at school. It's not much, but it's home for now." She nodded, as if filing the information away. "You are kind," she said after a pause. "Most would not help." Her words struck him, and he felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, at least not in his eyes. "I couldn't just leave you there," he said again, his voice quiet. "No one deserves to be left like that." She didn't respond, but the faint smile that crossed her lips was enough to let him know she understood. As the night deepened, he found himself growing more and more curious about her. There was so much he didn't know about her, her world, her people. But he didn't want to push her too hard, not when she was still recovering. Instead, he focused on the immediate problem, keeping her safe. If whoever had been chasing her was still looking, it was only a matter of time before they came here. And he had no idea how to protect her if they did. Still, he couldn't let fear paralyze him. She needed him, and for now, that was enough to keep him moving forward. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to face it head-on, no matter how impossible it seemed. The quiet of the night stretched on, but the unease in the boy's chest refused to settle. Each creak of the floorboards or distant sound from the hallway made his heart race. She had fallen asleep again, her breathing steady now, but the tension on her face hadn't faded. Whoever or whatever was after her wasn't far enough away to ease his worry. The way she'd spoken of them, the fear in her voice, hinted at something beyond anything he could comprehend. It wasn't just danger. It was the kind of terror that clung to someone even after they'd run. He stayed by her side, watching her sleep. The faint glow from the lines on her skin had dimmed, almost disappearing as she rested, though they still flickered faintly when she stirred. It was strange and beautiful, but also unnerving. Whatever she wasn't like anything he'd ever seen. He found himself wondering what her life must have been like before she ended up here. Did she have family? Friends? People who missed her? Or was she as alone out there as she seemed to be here? Outside, the wind howled softly, rattling the window. He got up to close it, his movements careful not to make a sound. As he looked out over the campus, a chill ran down his spine. The shadows between the buildings seemed deeper than usual, the stillness almost too perfect. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the knot in his stomach wouldn't go away. When he turned back to her, she was awake, her glowing eyes fixed on him. There was an urgency in her expression, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "They're coming," she said, her voice low but steady. His blood ran cold. "How do you know?" "I feel them," she said, sitting up slowly. Her movements were still stiff, but her determination was unmistakable. "Close. Searching." He swallowed hard, his mind racing. "What do we do?" "We can't stay here. They'll find you." She nodded, her jaw tight. "You must leave. I will face them." "No way," he said immediately, his voice rising. "I'm not leaving you two." "You don't understand," she interrupted, her tone firm. "They are not human. They will destroy everything to find me. If you stay, you will die." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he shook his head. "I don't care. I'm not letting you face them alone." For a moment, she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, her face softened. "You are brave," she said quietly. "But this is not your fight." "Maybe not," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "But you came here. You're hurt and alone, and I'm not going to let them take you without a fight." Something flickered in her eyes, respect, maybe, or gratitude. She nodded slowly, as if accepting his decision, even if she didn't agree with it. "Then we must move. They will find us here." He grabbed his jacket and a small backpack, stuffing it with anything he thought they might need: water, a flashlight, some food, and the first aid kit. She watched him silently, her glowing eyes tracking his every move. When he was ready, he turned to her. "Can you walk?" She hesitated, then swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her movements were slow, careful, but she managed to stand. He moved to her side, offering her his arm for support. She took it without a word, leaning on him as they made their way to the door. The hallway was empty, the usual chatter of students replaced by an eerie silence. They moved quickly but quietly, her steps growing steadier with each passing moment. As they reached the stairwell, she paused, her head tilting slightly as if listening for something. "What is it?" he whispered. "They are near," she said, her voice barely audible. "We must hurry." His heart pounded as they descended the stairs, each step feeling like it took an eternity. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that any moment something would emerge from the shadows. When they finally reached the ground floor, he pushed open the door to the outside, the cold night air hitting them like a wave. The campus was still, the usual hum of life completely absent. He guided her toward the woods, hoping the cover of trees would give them some advantage. She moved with surprising speed now, her earlier weakness seeming to fade as adrenaline took over. Still, he could see the strain on her face, the way her jaw clenched with every step. They were almost to the edge of the forest when she stopped abruptly, her grip on his arm tightening. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp. He froze, following her gaze. At first, he saw nothing, just the empty expanse of grass and trees. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A shadow, darker than the night, shifting between the trees.
His breath caught in his throat.
"What is that?" he whispered. "They have found us," she said, her tone grim. "We must run." Before he could respond, she pulled him forward, her strength surprising him. They plunged into the woods, the branches tearing at their clothes as they ran. Behind them, he could hear the faint sound of movement, the almost imperceptible rustle of something following them. He didn't dare look back. The trees closed in around them, the darkness growing thicker with every step. His lungs burned, his legs aching as he struggled to keep up with her. She seemed to move with an almost unnatural speed, her glowing eyes the only source of light in the suffocating blackness. They reached a small clearing, and she stopped suddenly, her chest heaving as she turned to face him. "We cannot outrun them," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "We must fight."
His heart sank.
"How? We don't even know what we're up against." She reached into the folds of her strange clothing, pulling out a small, glowing device. It pulsed faintly in her hand, casting an eerie light over her face. "This will help," she said. "But I cannot use it alone." He hesitated, fear clawing at him. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw the same determination that had driven him to help her in the first place. He nodded, his hands trembling as he reached for the device. "What do I do?" She placed it in his hands, her touch steady despite the tension in the air. "Follow my lead," she said. "And whatever happens, do not let go." Before he could ask what she meant, The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted. Something emerged, its form barely visible in the faint light. It moved with an unnatural grace, its presence sending a chill down his spine. He tightened his grip on the device, his heart racing as he braced himself for what was to come. The creature stepped forward, its form becoming clearer in the faint light of the device. Its body was unnervingly fluid, shifting and contorting as though it couldn't decide on a single shape. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, burned like embers, unblinking and fixed on them. The air around it seemed to hum, vibrating with an unnatural energy that sent shivers through his body. The girl stepped in front of him, her shoulders squared as if to shield him from whatever this thing was. He could see her hands trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Stay close to me," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the creature. "No matter what happens." He nodded, though his throat was too dry to respond. The device in his hands felt warm, almost alive, its pulsing light syncing with the rapid thudding of his heart. He had no idea what it was or how it could help, but he trusted her. He had to. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, its form rippling as it advanced. She raised her hands, the faint lines on her skin flaring to life, casting a soft glow across the clearing. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if the light repelled it. But then it surged forward, faster than he could have imagined, closing the distance between them in an instant. A burst of energy shot from her hands, slamming into the creature and knocking it back. The force of it was enough to send a shockwave through the clearing, rustling the trees and stirring up a cloud of dirt and leaves. But the creature recovered quickly, its body reforming almost immediately as it lunged again. "Use it now," she shouted, her voice strained. He looked down at the device, panic flooding his mind. How was he supposed to use it? There were no buttons, no obvious way to activate it. But then he felt it an almost magnetic pull, guiding his hands toward her. He held the device out, and as her glowing lines flared brighter, it began to respond, its light intensifying until the entire clearing was bathed in a blinding brilliance. The creature let out a piercing shriek, its body writhing as the light engulfed it. For a moment, he thought it was over, that they had defeated it. But then something changed. The light from the device dimmed suddenly, flickering as though something was interfering with it. The creature's form twisted violently, and he realized with growing horror that it wasn't retreating, it was adapting. "What's happening?" he yelled, his voice breaking. "They're stronger than I thought," she said through gritted teeth. "It's not just one. There are more." His stomach dropped. More? How many? The thought was paralyzing. He could barely comprehend dealing with one of these things, let alone an entire group. As if on cue, more shapes emerged from the shadows, their movements just as unnerving, their presence suffocating. They surrounded the clearing, cutting off any chance of escape. "We can't fight them all," he said, his voice shaking. She didn't respond immediately, her eyes darting between the advancing figures. Then, to his surprise, she turned to him, her expression softening despite the chaos around them. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said quietly. "Something you deserve to know." He stared at her, confused and terrified. "What are you talking about?" "These creatures," she began, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "They're not just after me. They're after us." "What do you mean?" he asked, his mind racing. "I'm just a human. I have nothing to do with this." She shook her head, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "You're not just a human. You've been marked ever since you touched that device. They can sense it now. They'll come for you, too."
His breath caught in his throat.
"Marked? What did that even mean? He wanted to argue, to deny it, but deep down, he felt it too. The device in his hands felt different now, almost like it was a part of him. The creature's focus wasn't just on her anymore, it was on him as well. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "We make a stand. Together." The words sent a jolt through him, equal parts fear and determination. He didn't know how they were going to survive this, but he wasn't about to abandon her, not now. He tightened his grip on the device, its light flickering as though responding to his resolve. The creatures closed in, their guttural sounds growing louder, more aggressive. She stepped closer to him, her glowing lines flaring brighter than ever. "Focus," she said, her voice firm. "Let the device guide you. It's not just a tool, it's a part of you now." He nodded, closing his eyes for a moment as he tried to center himself. The device pulsed in his hands, its rhythm syncing with his heartbeat. When he opened his eyes, the light was stronger, steadier. He could feel its power coursing through him, a strange but not unwelcome sensation. The first creature lunged, and he reacted without thinking, a burst of energy shooting from the device and slamming into it. The creature disintegrated on impact, its form dissolving into the air. But there was no time to celebrate, the others were already attacking. They fought, side by side, their movements almost in sync. The energy from the device combined with her own abilities, creating a force strong enough to hold the creatures at bay. But it was clear they couldn't keep this up forever. For every creature they destroyed, more seemed to take its place. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the ground beneath them began to shake. A low rumble filled the air, and the creatures froze, their forms flickering as though disrupted by the sudden shift. She turned to him, her eyes wide. "They're here," she said, her voice barely audible. "Who?" he asked, his heart pounding. Before she could answer, a blinding light filled the clearing, brighter than anything he'd ever seen. The creatures let out one final, piercing shriek before vanishing, their forms dissolving into the light. When it faded, they were gone, but they weren't alone. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, its form humanoid but unmistakably otherworldly. Its presence was overwhelming, radiating a power that made his knees weak. It spoke, its voice resonating in his mind rather than his ears. "You have interfered," it said, its tone cold and unyielding. "The balance has been disturbed." He felt a chill run down his spine, but she stepped forward, her posture defiant. "I did what I had to," she said, her voice steady. "You abandoned me, left me to die. I had no choice." The figure regarded her for a long moment before turning its gaze to him. "And you," it said, its voice sharp, "a human, unremarkable, yet now entangled in forces beyond your comprehension." He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. The figure's presence was too overwhelming, its judgment heavy and final. Whatever was happening, he knew their fight wasn't over, not yet. The silence that followed was deafening. He felt every second stretch, his mind racing to grasp the enormity of what was happening. The figure stood still, its presence radiating authority and finality. The girl, though visibly shaken, held her ground, her glowing lines pulsing faintly in defiance. For a moment, the clearing felt like a battleground frozen in time, with none of them willing to make the first move. But then the figure raised its hand and the air grew heavy, charged with an energy that felt suffocating. "You have meddled with forces you cannot comprehend," it said, its voice cutting through the silence. "The consequences are not yours to bear alone." The girl turned to him, her expression both determined and sorrowful. "I didn't want this for you," she said softly. "You were never supposed to be part of this." He shook his head, stepping closer to her. "Don't say that," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're in this together now. I'm not leaving you." Her eyes glistened with unspoken emotion, but there was no time for sentiment. The figure stepped forward, and with each step, the ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight. "You have shown resilience," it said, addressing them both. "But resilience alone does not absolve your actions." The device in his hands began to hum again, its light intensifying. He glanced down, realizing it was reacting to the figure's presence. The girl noticed too, her eyes widening in alarm. "It's connected to them," she said quickly. "You need to be careful." Before he could respond, the figure extended its hand toward him. A searing pain shot through his chest, and he staggered, clutching the device tightly. Images flooded his mind, flashes of alien worlds, ancient structures, and battles fought in the vastness of space. He could feel the weight of countless lifetimes pressing down on him, memories that weren't his, but somehow felt deeply familiar. "You hold the key," the figure said, its voice resonating with an eerie calm. "But the key is not meant for you." The girl stepped in front of him, her glow flaring brighter than ever. "If you want it, you'll have to go through me," she said firmly. The figure hesitated, its gaze shifting between them. "You would sacrifice yourself for this human?" it asked, its tone laced with disbelief. "He's more than just a human," she said, her voice unwavering. "He's proven himself, and I won't let you take him." The figure's expression remained unreadable, but something in its stance shifted. "Very well," it said finally. "The choice has been made." A surge of energy erupted from the figure, rushing toward them like a tidal wave. He braced himself, expecting the worst, but the device in his hands responded instinctively. Its light expanded, forming a protective barrier around them. The energy collided with the barrier, creating a shockwave that rippled through the clearing, but they remained unharmed. The figure seemed momentarily taken aback, its form flickering slightly. "You do not understand what you are unleashing," it warned, its voice carrying a note of urgency. "Maybe not," he replied, surprising even himself with his boldness. "But I'm not going to let you take her. We'll figure this out together." The figure's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before it began to retreat. "The balance has been disturbed," it said. "You have set events in motion that cannot be undone. Remember that your actions carry consequences." With that, the figure vanished, leaving the clearing eerily quiet once more. He let out a shaky breath, his grip on the device loosening as the tension in his body subsided. The girl turned to him, her glow dimming as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with equal parts relief and awe. He shook his head. "We did it," he corrected. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the figure's parting words. The balance had been disturbed. What did that mean? And what consequences were they now facing? As they began to make their way back through the forest, the device continued to hum faintly in his hands, its light a constant reminder of the power they had just wielded. He knew their journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Just as the forest began to thin and the familiar outlines of the campus came into view, he noticed something strange. The stars above seemed to flicker, their light shifting in patterns that didn't feel random. He stopped, staring up at the sky, a sense of unease creeping over him. "What is it?" she asked, following his gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think this is far from over." She nodded, her expression somber but resolute. "Then we'll be ready," she said. And as they stepped out of the forest and into the uncertain future, he couldn't help but feel that their story was only just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty and quiet resolve. He and the girl worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of knowledge they had about the device and the mysterious figure's warnings. The hum of the artifact became a constant presence, almost like a living heartbeat in the background of their every conversation. Its light flickered with a rhythm that seemed to respond to their emotions, sometimes glowing brighter when they stumbled upon a breakthrough, other times dimming when frustration overtook them. She explained more about her origins, slowly and cautiously, revealing bits and pieces of the story she'd been so reluctant to share. Her people, once a proud and thriving race, had been scattered by their own ambition. They had tampered with forces far beyond their understanding, unraveling the delicate balance that held their world together. The artifact, she said, was one of the last remnants of that power, a fragment of what her people had once controlled but could no longer contain. For her, coming to Earth had been both an escape and a punishment. Her own kind had banished her for defying their strict rules, for questioning the very foundations of the chaos they had brought upon themselves. She had hoped to live in peace, far away from the ruins of her past, but the arrival of the figure proved that her past had not forgotten her. It was a bitter realization that her exile was no sanctuary. He listened carefully, absorbing her story with a mix of fascination and sadness. It was clear to him that she carried a heavy burden, one that had shaped her every decision. Yet, as she spoke, he couldn't help but admire her strength. Despite everything, she had chosen to fight to protect him, even when it meant putting herself at risk. That kind of courage was rare, and he found himself more determined than ever to stand by her side. The campus buzzed with its usual life, students walking to and from classes, unaware of the extraordinary events unfolding in the shadows. He tried to keep up appearances, attending lectures and completing assignments, but his mind was always elsewhere. The girl stayed hidden in the forest most of the time, venturing out only when they needed to work together or search for answers. She adapted quickly, learning to navigate human habits and customs with an ease that was both impressive and unsettling. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they sat by the edge of the forest, watching the campus lights flicker on in the distance. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. He turned to her, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "Your home, I mean." She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know," she admitted after a moment. "I miss what it used to be. But the way it is now, no. It's not home anymore." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. There was a finality to her tone, a quiet acceptance of a loss that could never be undone. It made him wonder what it must feel like to carry that kind of loneliness, to be so far from everything familiar. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. They learned to trust each other completely, sharing not just their fears, but also their hopes. She confided in him about her dreams of finding a new purpose, of using what she had learned to create something better. And he, in turn, shared his aspirations, his desire to make a difference in the world, to be someone who mattered. Their collaboration bore fruit when they finally unlocked the artifact's deeper functions. It wasn't just a source of power or knowledge. It was a key, as the figure had said. But it wasn't meant to open doors. It was meant to close them. The artifact was designed to seal rifts between dimensions, to mend the fractures that her people had created. It was a tool of restoration, not destruction. The realization brought with it a sense of urgency. If the artifact was a key, then the figure's warning about disturbing the balance made more sense. The rifts were still active, still leaking energy that could destabilize not just her world, but others as well. They had to act quickly to find and close the rifts before it was too late. Their search led them to remote locations, guided by the artifact's light, which grew brighter as they approached areas of dimensional instability. Each rift they closed brought a sense of relief, but it also left them more drained, both physically and emotionally. The process was taxing, requiring immense concentration and coordination. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that failure was not an option. The figure reappeared during one of their final missions, its presence as imposing as ever. This time, however, it did not attack. Instead, it watched silently as they worked, its expression unreadable. When they succeeded in sealing the rift, the figure spoke, its tone softer than before. "You have done well," it said, "but the path you have chosen is fraught with danger. Are you prepared to face what lies ahead?" They exchanged a glance, understanding the gravity of the question. He nodded, his resolve unwavering. "We are," he said firmly. The figure seemed to consider this before stepping aside, allowing them to leave. It was a small gesture, but it felt like an acknowledgement of their efforts, a sign that they had earned its respect. By the time they returned to the campus, the artifact's light had dimmed, its energy almost entirely spent. They knew their journey was nearing its end, that their role in this chapter of the story was complete. But with that realization came a bittersweet sense of closure. They had accomplished what they set out to do, but it also meant saying goodbye to the life they had built together. On their final night, they stood beneath the stars, the artifact resting quietly between them. The girl turned to him, her expression a mix of gratitude and sadness. "You've given me more than I ever thought I could have," she said softly. "Thank you." He smiled, though his heart ached at the thought of her leaving. "You've taught me what it means to be brave," he replied. "I'll never forget that." As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she stepped into the light, her form glowing faintly as the artifact activated one last time. He watched as she disappeared, her figure dissolving into a cascade of shimmering particles. The forest grew still, the silence broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind. Life returned to normal in the weeks that followed, but he carried her memory with him, a reminder of the extraordinary journey they had shared. He found solace in the knowledge that she was out there, somewhere, continuing her quest to heal the wounds of her people's past. And as he looked up at the night sky, the stars twinkling like distant beacons, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Their story wasn't over, not really. It was just the beginning of something much larger, something that would continue to unfold across worlds and lifetimes. And in his heart, he knew he would always be a part of it.